The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Windsor as Marcus Thompson revved his Harley-Davidson outside the local coffee shop. At 28, Marcus was everything the establishment feared. Leather jacket worn thin from years of riding, tattoos snaking up his arms, and a reputation for speaking his mind regardless of consequences. He had grown up in the working-class neighborhoods just outside the Royal Borough, where his father had worked double shifts at the factory to keep food on the table. Marcus wasn't looking for trouble that Tuesday morning, but trouble had a way of finding him. He had just finished his coffee and was adjusting his helmet when he noticed the commotion near the castle gates. A small crowd had gathered, and voices were rising in what seemed like an argument. His curiosity got the better of him, and he walked his bike closer to see what was happening. At the center of the dispute stood Officer James Whitmore, a Royal Protection officer known throughout the area for his rigid adherence to protocol and his particular dislike for what he called undesirable elements in the vicinity of royal property. Whitmore was in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in his uniform with a military bearing that suggested years of service. He was confronting an elderly woman who appeared distressed and confused. The woman, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, was 83 years old and had been trying to deliver a handwritten letter to the palace. She explained tearfully that her late husband had served in the Royal Navy for 30 years, and she wanted to share some of his wartime memories with the royal family. She had traveled from Scotland, spending her limited pension money on the train fare, believing that her husband's service entitled her to at least have her letter received. Whitmore, however, was having none of it. He stood with his arms crossed, speaking in clipped, authoritative tones about proper channels, security protocols, and the impossibility of accepting unsolicited correspondence. His voice carried across the street as he told the elderly woman that she was wasting everyone's time and needed to move along immediately. Several tourists had stopped to watch, some recording the interaction on their phones. Marcus felt his jaw clench as he listened to the exchange. He had seen this kind of behavior before, authority figures using their power to intimidate those who couldn't fight back. The way Whitmore spoke to Mrs. Hartwell reminded him of every dismissive official his family had encountered over the years. Every time they had been made to feel small because they didn't have the right connections or speak with the right accent. Without fully thinking through the consequences, Marcus walked over to the group. His boots made a deliberate sound on the pavement, and the jingle of his bike keys announced his approach. Several people in the crowd turned to look at him, and he could see Whitmore's expression harden as he took in Marcus's appearance. The confrontation that would change both their lives was about to begin, sparked by a simple question that Marcus posed to the officer. He looked directly at Whitmore and asked why a woman who had traveled hundreds of miles to honor her deceased husband's service was being treated like a criminal. The question hung in the air, and Marcus could see the anger flash in the officer's eyes. This was more than just a disagreement about protocol. It was a clash between two different worlds, two different ideas about respect, authority, and human dignity. The crowd sensed the tension building and more people began to gather. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Mrs. Hartwell looked between the two men, clutching her letter tighter, unaware that her simple wish to honor her husband's memory was about to trigger a confrontation that would become the talk of the entire community. Marcus stood his ground, his questions still unanswered while Whitmore's face grew redder with each passing second. The morning that had started so peacefully was about to explode into something neither man had anticipated, but both seemed determined to see through to its conclusion. Officer Whitmore's response was swift and sharp. He stepped closer to Marcus, his voice dropping to a threatening tone as he told the biker to mind his own business and move along. The officer's years of training had taught him to project authority through his posture and voice, but Marcus wasn't intimidated. Instead, he stood taller, his own voice steady as he replied that watching a public servant bully an elderly woman was everyone's business. The crowd around them grew larger, drawn by the obvious tension between the two men. Whitmore could feel eyes on him and his training kicked in. He began reciting regulations about loitering, public disturbance, and unauthorized presence near royal property. His tone became more official, more threatening as he warned Marcus about the consequences of interfering with official duties. Marcus listened to the lecture with growing frustration. He had heard this type of bureaucratic intimidation before, and it only strengthened his resolve. When Whitmore finished his speech, Marcus calmly asked if helping an elderly woman deliver a letter honoring her dead husband was really a threat to national security. The question drew murmurs of agreement from several people in the crowd, and Marcus could see that public opinion was shifting in his favor. This only made Whitmore angrier. He was used to having his authority respected without question, especially by people like Marcus, whom he considered beneath his social station. The officer's next words would prove to be a serious mistake. In a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, he told Marcus that people like him, pointing at his leather jacket and tattoos, had no business telling respectable officers how to do their jobs. He added that maybe if Marcus spent less time on his motorcycle and more time learning respect for authority, he might understand how the real world worked. The crowd fell silent at this obvious display of prejudice. Several people exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed. Marcus felt the familiar burn of injustice that had driven him to speak up in the first place, but now it was personal. Whitmore hadn't just dismissed his question. He had dismissed him as a person based on his appearance and lifestyle choices. Marcus's response was measured, but powerful. He spoke clearly, ensuring everyone could hear, as he explained that his father had worked 2 jobs for 30 years to support his family, that his sister was a nurse who saved lives every day, and that he himself volunteered at a local shelter for homeless veterans. He asked Whitmore what gave him the right to judge anyone's worth based on their clothes or their choice of transportation. The officer realized he had made an error in judgment, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. Instead, he doubled down on his authority, threatening to arrest Marcus for disorderly conduct and obstruction of justice. He reached for his radio, clearly intending to call for backup, but Marcus remained calm. He told Whitmore that he was welcome to call anyone he wanted, but that wouldn't change the fact that he was wrong to treat Mrs. Hartwell so poorly. Mrs. Hartwell, who had been watching this exchange with growing amazement, finally found her voice. She thanked Marcus for standing up for her and said that her husband would have done the same thing. Her words carried weight with the crowd, many of whom were tourists who had come to see the royal sights and were now witnessing something very different from what they had expected. Whitmore's radio crackled to life as backup officers responded to his call. The situation was escalating beyond what anyone had anticipated, and Marcus knew that things were about to get more complicated. But he also knew that sometimes standing up for what's right means accepting the consequences, regardless of how unfair they might be. As sirens grew louder in the distance, Marcus looked at Mrs. Hartwell and promised her that someone would make sure her letter reached the right people. He then turned to face Whitmore, ready for whatever came next, knowing that this confrontation was far from over. 3 police cars arrived within minutes, their lights flashing as officers quickly assessed the situation. Whitmore immediately took control of the narrative, describing Marcus as an agitator who had interfered with official duties and refused to comply with lawful orders. He painted a picture of a dangerous individual who posed a threat to public safety and royal security. Marcus was handcuffed and placed in the back of a police car while dozens of witnesses watched. Several tourists continued recording the incident, and the footage was already beginning to spread on social media. As the car pulled away, Marcus could see Mrs. Hartwell standing alone on the sidewalk, still clutching her letter, looking lost and confused about what had just happened. At the police station, Marcus was charged with disorderly conduct, obstruction of justice, and interfering with a police officer in the performance of his duties. The charges were serious enough to potentially result in jail time and a criminal record that would affect his employment prospects for years to come. Whitmore had made sure the charges reflected the maximum possible consequences for Marcus's actions, but Whitmore had underestimated the power of modern technology and public opinion. The videos recorded by tourists began appearing on social media platforms within hours of the incident. The footage clearly showed an elderly woman being dismissed rudely by an officer, followed by a calm and articulate young man standing up for her rights. The contrast between Whitmore's aggressive behavior and Marcus's measured responses was stark and damaging to the officer's reputation. Local news stations picked up the story by evening, and it quickly became a talking point about class, authority, and respect. The images of Marcus being arrested for defending an elderly veteran's widow resonated with people across different social and economic backgrounds. Support began building through online communities, with many people sharing their own experiences of being treated poorly by officials who abused their authority. Mrs. Hartwell, meanwhile, had returned to her small hotel room, deeply shaken by the day's events. She felt responsible for what had happened to Marcus and couldn't stop thinking about how a simple attempt to honor her husband's memory had led to such chaos. She had never been involved in anything controversial in her entire life, and the attention was overwhelming. A local journalist named Sarah Chen had seen the social media posts and decided to investigate the story further. She tracked down Mrs. Hartwell and listened to her account of the incident. The elderly woman's story was heartbreaking. She had saved money for months to make the trip, believing that her husband's 30 years of naval service meant something to the royal family. All she wanted was for someone to read his wartime diary excerpts and know that he had served with honor. Sarah's investigation revealed more troubling information about Officer Whitmore's history. She discovered several other incidents where he had been accused of using excessive authority, particularly against people from working-class backgrounds. There had been complaints filed over the years, but they had been dismissed or buried in bureaucratic procedures. The pattern suggested that Marcus and Mrs. Hartwell were not isolated victims but part of a larger problem. The story that Sarah published the next day changed everything. It included interviews with Mrs. Hartwell, details about her husband's military service, and background information about the charges against Marcus. She also included statements from several witnesses who described Whitmore's behavior as aggressive and unprofessional. The article painted a clear picture of an abuse of power that had gone unchecked for too long. Public opinion began to shift dramatically in Marcus's favor. Letters to newspaper editors, social media campaigns, and phone calls to local officials all demanded justice for the young man who had simply tried to help an elderly woman. The incident had struck a nerve about fairness, respect, and the proper use of authority in a democratic society. Whitmore, meanwhile, was beginning to realize that his actions had consequences he hadn't anticipated. The scrutiny was intense, and his superiors were asking difficult questions about his conduct. The incident that he had thought would be quickly forgotten was instead becoming the defining moment of his career, and not in the way he had intended. Within 48 hours of the incident, the story had exploded beyond the local community. National news networks picked up the footage, and the hashtag #IceYourJusticeForMarcus began trending across social media platforms. The video of the confrontation had been viewed millions of times, with people from around the world expressing outrage at what they saw as a clear abuse of authority. Marcus, who had been released on bail, found himself at the center of a media storm he never could have imagined. Reporters camped outside his modest apartment, and his phone rang constantly with interview requests. Legal organizations specializing in civil rights cases reached out, offering to represent him free of charge. The young man who had simply tried to help an elderly woman was now the face of a movement challenging authority and advocating for basic human dignity. Pressure on law enforcement officials became intense. The local police chief, Commander Patricia Walsh, found herself fielding calls from government officials, media outlets, and citizen advocacy groups. The incident was becoming a public relations nightmare for the entire department, and she knew that decisive action was necessary to maintain public trust. Commander Walsh ordered a full internal investigation into Officer Whitmore's conduct, not just regarding the recent incident, but also examining his entire service record. What the investigation uncovered was disturbing. There were dozens of complaints that had been filed over the years, many from people who felt they had been treated unfairly because of their appearance, social status, or economic background. The complaints had often been dismissed because the complainants lacked the resources or knowledge to pursue them effectively. Mrs. Hartwell, despite her advanced age and the stress of the situation, had become determined to see justice done. She gave multiple interviews speaking eloquently about her husband's service and her belief that Marcus had simply done what any decent person would do. Her dignity and grace in the face of the controversy won her widespread public sympathy and support. The royal family, through their representatives, found themselves in an awkward position. While they couldn't comment directly on an ongoing legal case, the incident had occurred at their gates and involved their security personnel. Behind the scenes, there were serious discussions about protocol, public relations, and the need to distance the royal household from Whitmore's actions. A week after the incident, Commander Walsh held a press conference that would change the trajectory of the entire case. Standing before a room packed with journalists and cameras, she announced that the internal investigation had revealed serious concerns about Officer Whitmore's conduct, not just in the recent incident but throughout his career. She revealed that multiple complaints had been inadequately investigated and that there was evidence of a pattern of discriminatory behavior. Most surprisingly, Walsh announced that all charges against Marcus would be dropped immediately. She stated that the evidence clearly showed he had acted within his rights as a citizen to question what appeared to be unfair treatment of an elderly woman. She acknowledged that the arrest had been inappropriate and apologized on behalf of the entire police department. The announcement sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and vindicated Marcus in the eyes of the public. But Walsh wasn't finished. She also announced that Officer Whitmore was being suspended pending a formal disciplinary hearing and that new protocols would be implemented to ensure such incidents couldn't happen in the future. Whitmore, watching the press conference from his home, felt his world collapsing around him. His career, which he had built over 15 years, was in ruins. The respect and authority he had worked so hard to establish were gone, replaced by public ridicule and professional disgrace. He began to realize that his actions had consequences that extended far beyond what he had ever imagined. Marcus, meanwhile, was processing the dramatic turn of events. The charges that had threatened to destroy his future were gone, but the experience had changed him. He had seen how quickly the justice system could work when public pressure demanded it, but he also understood how many people without media attention or public support might not be so fortunate. The case was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted dramatically. The biker who had been dismissed and arrested was now vindicated, while the officer who had abused his authority faced an uncertain future. The vindication Marcus received was only the beginning of what would become an extraordinary turn of events. 3 days after the charges were dropped, he received a phone call that left him speechless. The caller identified himself as private secretary to a senior member of the royal family, and he was extending a formal invitation for both Marcus and Mrs. Hartwell to visit the palace. The royal family had been following the incident closely through their staff, and they were deeply troubled by what had transpired at their gates. The invitation was their way of demonstrating that Whitmore's behavior did not represent their values or their respect for people like Mrs. Hartwell's husband, who had served the crown with honor. Marcus was stunned by the invitation. The same gates where he had been arrested just weeks earlier would now welcome him as an honored guest. When he called Mrs. Hartwell to share the news, the elderly woman broke down in tears. After all these years, someone in authority was finally going to listen to her husband's story and acknowledge his service. The meeting was arranged quietly, away from media attention, to ensure privacy and dignity for all involved. On the appointed day, Marcus traded his leather jacket for a simple suit, though he kept his motorcycle boots as a small gesture of remaining true to himself. Mrs. Hartwell wore her finest dress and carried the precious letter that had started everything. When they arrived at the palace, they were greeted not with suspicion or protocol barriers, but with warmth and genuine respect. The royal family member who met with them spent over an hour listening to Mrs. Hartwell read excerpts from her husband's wartime diary. The stories of naval battles, heroic rescues, and quiet courage moved everyone in the room. Marcus found himself in the surreal position of discussing social justice and community relations with one of the most privileged families in the world. But the conversation was genuine and productive. The royal family member expressed concern about the incident and asked detailed questions about Marcus's perspective on how authority figures could better serve their communities. The meeting concluded with Mrs. Hartwell's letter being formally accepted into the royal archives, ensuring that her husband's service would be permanently recognized and remembered. She was also given a personal letter of thanks from the royal family, acknowledging her husband's contribution to the nation's defense. For Marcus, the experience was transformative. The same establishment that had dismissed and arrested him was now treating him with respect and asking for his opinions. It was a powerful lesson about the difference between individual prejudice and institutional values, and how public pressure could force positive change. News of the royal meeting eventually leaked to the media, creating another wave of positive coverage for Marcus and Mrs. Hartwell. The image of a tattooed biker being welcomed into the palace became a powerful symbol of social progress and the importance of judging people by their actions rather than their appearance. Officer Whitmore, meanwhile, was facing the consequences of his actions. The disciplinary hearing had concluded with his dismissal from the police force. The panel found that his conduct had been discriminatory, unprofessional, and damaging to public trust in law enforcement. His career in law enforcement was over, and his reputation was in ruins. But Whitmore's humiliation was far from complete. Civil rights organizations had taken up Marcus's case, and they were pursuing legal action against both Whitmore personally and the police department that had enabled his behavior for so many years. The lawsuit sought not just financial damages but also systemic changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. The contrast between the two men's situations was stark. Marcus, who had started as the victim of authority abuse, was now being celebrated as a hero and advocate for justice. Whitmore, who had wielded authority carelessly, had lost everything he had worked to build. The reversal of fortune was complete and dramatic. The story had captured public imagination because it represented fundamental questions about power, respect, and justice that resonated with people from all walks of life. It showed how one moment of moral courage could lead to extraordinary consequences, both positive and negative, depending on which side of right and wrong you found yourself. 6 months after the incident, the transformation in both men's lives was remarkable. Marcus had become an unlikely spokesperson for civil rights and police accountability. He received speaking invitations from universities, community organizations, and law enforcement training academies. His message was simple but powerful. Respect and dignity should be afforded to everyone, regardless of their appearance or social status. The legal case against Whitmore and the police department had resulted in a substantial settlement. Marcus used his portion of the money to establish a foundation that provided legal assistance to people who couldn't afford to fight cases of authority abuse. He named it the Hartwell Foundation, honoring the elderly woman whose courage had inspired him to speak up in the first place. Mrs. Hartwell had become something of a celebrity herself. At 84, she found herself giving interviews and speaking at veterans' events about her husband's service and the importance of standing up for what's right. The letter that had been rejected so rudely was now displayed in a place of honor in the Royal Military Museum, ensuring that her husband's story would inspire future generations. The case had also prompted significant changes in police training and protocol. New guidelines were implemented requiring officers to treat all citizens with equal respect, regardless of their appearance or social background. Cultural sensitivity training became mandatory, and there were new procedures for handling complaints against officers who abused their authority. Marcus continued to ride his motorcycle, but now he was often recognized and greeted with respect rather than suspicion. He had proven that you could challenge authority and create positive change while remaining true to your identity and values. His leather jacket and tattoos no longer marked him as an outsider, but as someone who had the courage to stand up for others. Officer Whitmore's life had taken a very different trajectory. Unemployable in law enforcement and facing financial difficulties from the legal judgments against him, he had been forced to take a series of low-paying jobs. The man who had once wielded authority over others now found himself in positions where he was subject to the authority of supervisors who often treated him with the same lack of respect he had once shown to people like Marcus. The irony was not lost on those who followed the story. Whitmore was experiencing firsthand what it felt like to be judged and dismissed based on circumstances beyond his control. Some people felt sorry for him, believing his punishment was too severe. Others felt it was appropriate justice for years of discriminatory behavior. In a surprising development, Whitmore eventually reached out to Marcus through intermediaries, requesting a private meeting. He wanted to apologize personally and try to make amends for his actions. Marcus agreed to meet, curious about what the former officer had to say and hoping that something positive might come from the encounter. The meeting took place in a small cafe, far from media attention. Whitmore looked different, older, humbler, and clearly struggling with the consequences of his actions. He offered a sincere apology to Marcus, acknowledging that his behavior had been wrong and that he had let his prejudices cloud his judgment. He asked for forgiveness, not expecting it but hoping to find some peace. Marcus listened carefully to what Whitmore had to say. He could see genuine remorse in the former officer's eyes, and he believed the apology was sincere. While he couldn't forget what had happened, Marcus chose to forgive, recognizing that holding on to anger would only hurt himself. He even offered to help Whitmore find work through his connections in the community. The private reconciliation between the two men never became public knowledge, but it represented an important closure to their conflict. It showed that even the most bitter disputes could be resolved through genuine accountability and forgiveness. Both men had learned valuable lessons about the importance of treating others with dignity and respect. The foundation that Marcus had established continued to grow, helping dozens of people fight cases of authority abuse and discrimination. Mrs. Hartwell remained an active supporter, often speaking at fundraising events about the importance of standing up for justice. The incident that had started with such conflict had ultimately created positive change that extended far beyond the original participants. 2 years after that fateful morning outside the palace gates, the annual memorial service for veterans took on special significance. Marcus stood at the podium, no longer the angry young man who had confronted authority, but a mature advocate who had learned to channel his passion for justice into meaningful action. He was delivering the keynote address to an audience that included veterans, government officials, and community leaders. In the front row sat Mrs. Hartwell, now 85 but still sharp and engaged. Beside her was an empty chair with her husband's naval cap placed on it, a tribute to the man whose story had sparked everything that followed. She beamed with pride as Marcus spoke about the importance of honoring service members and standing up for those who couldn't defend themselves. The Hartwell Foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. It now employed 12 lawyers and social workers who specialized in cases involving abuse of authority. They had won over 40 cases in 2 years, securing not just financial compensation for victims, but also policy changes that prevented similar incidents. Marcus had discovered that his real talent wasn't just confronting injustice, but building systems to prevent it. The royal family had remained supportive of the foundation's work, making annual donations and occasionally hosting events at the palace. The relationship that had begun with such conflict had evolved into a partnership for positive social change. Marcus had even been invited to serve on a government committee examining police accountability measures. Officer Whitmore's story had taken an unexpected turn as well. After their private reconciliation, Marcus had indeed helped him find work with a local charity that assisted homeless veterans. The irony was profound. The man who had once dismissed people based on their appearance was now working with society's most marginalized individuals. The work had changed him fundamentally, teaching him humility and compassion he had never possessed before. Whitmore had also begun speaking at police training academies, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and abuse of authority. His presentations were powerful because they came from someone who had experienced the consequences of such behavior firsthand. Many officers found his transformation inspiring, and recruitment standards had been raised partly based on lessons learned from his case. The media attention around the story had eventually faded, but its impact continued to ripple through society. The video of that morning confrontation was still used in training programs for police officers, social workers, and customer service representatives. It had become a case study in how quickly situations could escalate when authority figures forgot their responsibility to serve all citizens equally. Marcus still rode his motorcycle through the streets of Windsor, but now he was often stopped by people who wanted to thank him or share their own stories of standing up for what was right. He had learned that courage was contagious. When one person took a stand, it inspired others to do the same. The foundation received dozens of letters each month from people who said his example had motivated them to speak up in their own communities. Mrs. Hartwell had lived to see her husband's story preserved not just in the royal archives but in the hearts and minds of countless people who had been inspired by his service and her determination to honor it. She often said that while she missed her husband terribly, she was grateful that his memory had contributed to making the world a little more just. The annual memorial service concluded with the reading of names of fallen servicemen, including Mrs. Hartwell's husband. As his name was called, the entire audience stood in respect. Marcus looked out at the crowd, veterans, families, officials, and ordinary citizens united in honoring those who had served their country. The young man who had once been dismissed as a troublemaker was now recognized as a leader and advocate for justice. The elderly woman who had been rudely turned away from the palace gates was now honored as a hero who had sparked positive change. And the officer who had abused his authority had found redemption through service to others. The story that began with conflict had evolved into one of transformation, forgiveness, and hope. It proved that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or violence, but with courage, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to treating every person with dignity and respect. The legend of that morning confrontation would continue to inspire future generations to stand up for what's right, no matter how intimidating the opposition might seem.